Dynamic voices for a diverse church. This is Pass the Mic.
Greetings and God bless. Welcome to another episode of Pass the Mic, Dynamic Voices for a Diverse Church, powered by The Witness, a Black Christian collective. I'm your host, Tyler Burns. You can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at BurnsClan. Please follow at your own risk. And joining us, as always, is the founder of The Witness. He is the man, the myth, the legend, the two-time best-selling author, Mr. Blue Check Verified himself, Dr. Jemar Tisby. What's going on, brother?
Feeling nostalgic today, bro.
Feeling super nostalgic.
Yeah.
And then we have a third person on the mic. He rarely comes out of the shadows. He is the man behind the curtain. He is the man at the desk in front of the computer. He is the man who makes everything run on time. He is the man who produces and makes us sound good. Of course, we're talking about the award-winning producer, the real Beau York. What's going on, brother?
I like how it progressively sounded way cooler, because at first it sounded really nerdy. Like, dude, he's behind the desk. He does the calendars. But he's a great guy.
He does logistics.
It's kind of like getting to know you. It's like, okay, but then you get to like, oh, this guy's awesome.
He's like, you do that.
Something to him.
No, you once called me the Boba Fett of Pass the Mic. Like, it's like you have to be kind of a super fan to know that I even exist.
I did call you that.
I like that.
That is a compliment.
I
agree.
I was cooking when I said that.
I thought I was going to get
bag, yo.
Thanks for having me on, guys.
So we have Beau on the mic because this is a historic episode. Y'all, we are celebrating 10 years of Pass the Mic.
Wow. 10 years.
A decade.
And we are together in the same room recording a retrospective of the past 10 years. And Jemar, I don't even know what to say, number one.
Look, bro, when we started going through episode titles, download numbers, because when we're in it, we have this impression, oh, it was up, it's down, it was good, it was hot, whatever. But then when we looked at what was actually there, it was, honestly, not to get it all woo-woo, like God's faithfulness. Like, I remember when this started, I don't even know if we're at this part of the show. I'm just going to say it. We had dabbled a little bit. This was back when Philip Holmes was on the mic. Beau will tell you we had a trash audio setup with one mic, and we had dabbled a little bit. But when we got serious, we were coming back from the whitest Christian conference I've ever been to, which is saying a lot. We were coming back from the Desiring God conference. The theme that year was C.S. Lewis.
Perfect mortal like C.S. Lewis. This is the 50th anniversary of his death. He died on the same day that John F. Kennedy was assassinated. That's how you can remember it. And it has seemed to many of us that a conference like this would be a small expression of what we feel very deeply in terms of admiration and thankfulness.
No knocks on C.S. Lewis. It just ain't something that a lot of black folk come out for. So we were coming, and we had driven from Jackson up to Minneapolis. I looked it up. It's a 15-hour drive without stops. And so coming back, it was like an all-nighter. It was me, Philip, this dude named Simon Baba, and I was like, the next thing is podcasting. We had the website at that point. We were blogging. We had a Facebook page. I was like, the next thing we need to really go in on this podcast.
But you need to understand, when Jemar says going on podcasting, they launched what was the most instantly grab your attention, Steve Jobs-esque about to drop a product. What was the name of the podcast, Jemar?
What was the name of the podcast?
The Reformed African American Network
Reformed
podcast.
African American Network podcast.
In case you needed some help.
No, it's the principle of calling a duck a duck. It is what it is. But
that's what I always do.
I remember very specifically because I met Phil by chance. I had just started Podastery, and I was working on another show, or we'd just launched another show. And I remember he was sitting at the cigar shop that I was working with at the time. And, it was him and Simon and somebody else. And I was thinking, okay, I need to start getting used to telling people I've got a business and trying to that sort of thing.
So literally, I need to start getting used to black people.
I need to start getting used to all this blackness.
I grew up in Jackson, Mississippi. I was like, no, I've got to actually get ready to start talking about this fact that I've got this business. So I sit down, and lo and behold, Phil starts telling me about this podcast, and he's talking it up. And so I finally get a chance to listen to it. I think I was probably one of y'all's first listeners.
That's when I knew I had to swoop in and save this thing.
He's like, Jemar was your wife and me. These were the only two listeners.
The conversations were great, but the quality, I thought I could help. I was like, I'm still kind of new at this, but I think I might be able to bring something to the table.
Okay, so let's set the expectation for what the next however many minutes is going to be. Okay, so two things. We are going to tell the history and the story of Pastor Mike. And we have never sat down and actually really broken down this particular aspect of what brought us to the place where we're at right now. And now we have thousands of people who listen to the podcast every episode. But number two, so number one, there's going to be a little bit of insider here. Follow us, go with us, because you're actually going to find some episodes that you can actually go back and listen to. I actually really recommend you going back and listen to, especially if you have joined the podcast listening since the pandemic. I need you to go back and listen to some of these episodes. I really feel like you'll gain an appreciation for how far we've come and also what has shaped what you're listening to right now. And number two is we're going to be really honest on this podcast. So I want to set the expectation that you're going to hear us be a little bit more unfiltered about what we've navigated as we've gone through this, what we were feeling at the time, and not just simply, it was hard. No, I actually want to get into the details and the weeds of what we were feeling at this time.
I'm not thinking like, how honest are we actually going to get?
I mean, as honest as you feel led to. I don't want to disrespect anybody, but like honestly, like with Jemar starting, I think that's like the right way to start. No, I was at the whitest Christian conference I've ever been at. Let's get into that because I feel like that's going to really serve people to understand the story. Now, okay, so episode 0, because there was supposed to be episode 1 that was supposed to launch in January of 2014. But then there was episode 0. Now, January of 2014, the plan was that we're going to interview this black preacher who some of you have heard of named H.B. Charles Jr., and very popular preacher in Jacksonville, and now kind of the black guy who speaks at the white conferences, right? That's kind of like I told you it was going to be honest. I got to set the tone. So kind of like the black man who speaks for white Baptist, SBC, kind of your John MacArthur space people. That's just his thing. That's just his shtick. So that was going to be number 1. But at the time, I mean, all of us venerated him and still do. He's a great preacher. He's great at what he does. And then December of 2013, something happens. And Jemar, can you talk about what happened December of 2013 that led to Pastor Mike having an episode 0?
Welcome to Pastor Mike Live. I'm Jemar Tisby. And I'm Philip Holmes. If you just joined us when we first went live, you heard a few excerpts from a panel at a recent conference hosted by the National Center for Family Integrated Churches. This panel was asked what they thought about hip-hop, what they thought specifically about reform rap. And for the most part, they all responded negatively.
So one of the through lines here is like conversations are happening about us or black people or black Christians that we were never a part of creating, but we sort of get sucked into and feel compelled to respond to, because if we don't, some really negative, bad ideas are going to be out there. This our first episode, and we were responding to a conference put on by the National Center for Family Integrated Churches. And there was a panel, and somehow the question of Christian hip hop came up. And this is a panel of all white men, all ultra conservative. Right. And what they said about Christian hip hop, and by corollary, the artists and the people who listen to the music, was absolute trash.
And when it comes to the art form of hip hop, very few will disagree with the cultural milieu out of which it grew, what it was intended to express by those who created the art form.
And what concerns me about this so-called art form, it's a picture of weakness and surrender on the part of people who think they're serving God and they're not. They're serving their own flesh. They're caving into the world. They're disobedient cowards. They're not really willing to engage in the fight that needs to be engaged. And Scott, thank you.
I mean, they basically said it was one step away from being demonic, that you couldn't have Christian music in a hip hop form. And it was so insulting to our culture because so many people had come into or had a new appreciation of Christianity and the faith because it was packaged in this culturally resonant form that these men had no clue about and didn't understand. So we put together a panel to respond, and that was our first episode.
So we went back and actually watched a video that was a test drive video, and it really showed a totally different side. So it reminded me that I had met Jemar in 2012 at a conference in Atlanta.
What's going on, y'all? This is your dude KB, and I'm so excited to announce that Man Up is not over. Men, you do not want to miss this. We are going to come together and rally around God's word that you may be equipped to go back wherever you live and serve as a man after God's own heart.
And what's so funny is I didn't think I could make the conference because we would have to drive back that Saturday evening and make it to church. So we'd have to leave Atlanta at like 11 or 12 and then drive all the way back home, which was 5 hours, to go to church in the morning. And in the session of Saturday afternoon, I think it was a Saturday afternoon session, I was kind of winding down. Got up, walk out, and I meet Jemar because he's standing at the RTS booth.
I'm recruiting for the Reformed Seminary.
I remember.
So we talked for about an hour just straight. Instant chemistry, instant connection. And so then I saw him again at TGC, and that's when I met Phil. And then Phil and I connected because he's like, yo, Jemar told me you're youth pastor, you do some writing. So Phil and I, Phil said, yo, drive up to Legacy Conference with me. He said, meet me in Jackson, then we'll drive up. So I drove up to Jackson, hopped in the car with Phil, and we drove all the way up to Chicago, which there and back was a 24-hour trip. So I spent literally 24 hours.
All these faithful drives.
Youth, yes.
I spent literally 24 hours in the car with Phil, and he's like, bro, I was doing recaps at that time for Rapzilla. So I was working for Rapzilla. And so I wrote the recaps for the Legacy Conference. And he was like, yo, you got to write for The Witness. Oh, well, at that time it was RAAN. You got to write for RAAN. So I'm just giving you that backstory to say, then I met y'all in Jackson. That's when I spent a lot of time, saw Beau, the whole team, took photos with y'all. It was wild. Like, I was like, what is all of this? And it was funny because I was in the room and nobody knew who I was. Like, nobody knew anything. There was just like, oh yeah, he seems kind of cool. Like, yo, you want to hang out with us? Like, I remember, I told you we're gonna be honest. Y'all went to somebody's house. I think it was Beau's house or somebody's house. Everybody had wine and everything. I was like, no, I don't drink. You know?
He hadn't turned 21 yet.
Right. Dog, like, no, I had. Like, I was like, dog, I'm a Pentecostal youth pastor. I don't drink wine.
Was that before? All right. So as I'm remembering, like, somebody was recording some video for like a promo video, right? That was going to go out. And I remember that we were discussing the podcast, but I guess it hadn't actually launched at that point.
Yeah. So we discussed the podcast, and this is what I remember is you talked about podastery. And I was just like, what in the world is this brother talking about? And then Phil got up on the whiteboard with Jemar and said, let's name some guests we'd like to have. So we filled the whiteboard with a whole bunch of guests, prospective guests. So it's like, oh, we could have H.B. Charles. And they were like, yeah, we could have. And I was like, oh, what about Brian Laritz? And he was like, oh, he doesn't really rock with us because we have the Reform label. Oh, we could have this. I told y'all we'd be honest. So, we had this person. We had that person.
People don't rock with us.
We have Voddie Baucham. We have this person. We have Piper. We'd have Tim Keller. And oh man, if we get Tim Keller, that's like a big. So we have filled it up. But what was missing, it was guests, but it wasn't necessarily commentary. It was like, we're going to be the interview show. We thought we were going to be
an interview show, yeah.
So we're going to be the interview show. So that leads us to episode 0.
So that's the thing, right? Because like interview show is, yes, the great thing was you and Phil being the host of the show at the time, y'all were both in Jackson. And all the equipment was set up at my house. So it's like, y'all come in, sit down, record. We've got some good quality, clean audio. We've got all of these different people, a lot of which are pastors. And this is like in like the pre-blow up of podcast times.
Before virtual anything. Yeah.
Exactly. Nobody had like microphones or set up. So we had to I remember doing tech support a lot of times with some of these guys the night before the interview and everything to get them prepped and make sure that we had all the tech work. But this was the first time we'd ever tried anything like this. And it was a quick turnaround because we were responding to this. And it was the first time on a feed that didn't exist. You know what I mean? Like literally it was kind of like a launch type situation. So we had to try this out. Like we had to figure out all the tech stuff, right? And to get everything ready. And this is the great thing. We just recently uncovered this video of just the tech test. And there We got Baba, we've got Phil in studio, but Jemar is calling in because you're simulating what it'll be like to have somebody call in. But see, we were going to have another guest and we needed somebody else to call in. So who did we have on the podcast before the podcast was even the podcast? Tyler Burns.
Really?
This is Marlena. Yeah.
I can't see my head. Hi.
Can't wait until you guys move to Jackson.
That's so cool.
Hey, Tyler. Tyler.
Hey, man.
Good job, son.
Hey, high five, bro. High five.
I won't give you a high five till she's from Jackson, yo.
It's a transition.
It's all grace, man. It's all grace. That's what the gospel does, man.
Yeah, so I was actually calling from the church at that time. And so I was doing that, and I was like, yeah, I'll call in. And then
He has his girlfriend with him?
who at the time was my girlfriend, obviously not my wife, she leaned in, and y'all were heavily recruiting me to Jackson. So when I was up there, I'd seen the campus, everything. It was just heavily recruiting me to RTS Jackson. And so we called in, and I did not remember.
I wanted you in Jackson. He wanted you at RTS. I like that one.
Yeah, I did not remember.
my
I
job.
did not remember that I had been tech support and basically kept the seat warm for like propaganda, who was going to be on the episode. You know?
Well, it was significant because we've always gone back and said, well, when did Tyler become co-host?
Yes.
When did he get involved? And this just was like a God thing that he was actually there before there was a there.
Right in the primordial stages.
And we got video of it. So Beau was able to pull up actual video
even
footage of
remember
it.
that.
So that first episode was actually a panel conversation responding to some white Christian foolishness that was racist and against, our culture and all that stuff. So
Should we play the 30-minute setup clip with like the record scratch and everything?
Please don't.
Probably not.
Please
No.
just play.
at least a sound
Please
bite.
don't. Like,
It's
you play
really
a little
good.
bit of it,
It's
but not
really
the
good.
whole thing.
Oh, man.
Right? So you have that, and you have the first episode. Now, the first episode is January 2014. Now, I think my first official episode on Pass the Mic was August of 2014. Because if I'm not mistaken, at that point,
As a guest.
as a guest. Now, if I'm not mistaken, at that point, we weren't doing weekly episodes. Like, it was a little bit more like a couple of times a month.
Adam Thomason. We also have Tyler Burns. Tyler is currently serving as a youth pastor in Pensacola, Florida, as well as a television host and contributor for Rapzilla and RAAN Network. Welcome, Tyler.
Howdy, thanks for having me.
We also
Is that
have
right?
Mookshay.
There was like a level, I don't think we were doing everything like weekly. Like, I think there were gaps and breaks. But if I'm not mistaken, I feel like I was on like the 6th episode of Pass the Mic. But I think it was much more ensemble back then. When you look back on it, it was much more like an ensemble of The Witness versus its own
RAAN.
entity. Oh, excuse me, I'm so sorry. An ensemble of RAAN versus its own entity.
Put some respect on his name, man. That's part of our journey.
No,
okay?
absolutely. I just literally made the mistake. But an ensemble of RAAN versus its own distinct entity. And so I remember I came on talking about social media with Phil, and I referenced a Douglas Rushkoff book called Present Shock or something like that. I remember.
Like people really have such short attention spans now because of social media. I mentioned in the video on Facebook that one of the things I see that harms us is we're so quick to try to get people because of what we see on our nightly news cycle.
I got way better memories than I do.
I
Go for
remember
it.
like I was recording on just an old beat up laptop. I just didn't have any tech. It was just trashed. It was just awful. And so I was doing that, and then in 2014, all hell breaks loose when Mike Brown is killed.
There is growing outrage tonight after an unarmed African-American teenager was shot and killed by police in the St. Louis suburb of Ferguson, Missouri. But there are conflicting reports about what led up to the shooting.
And that's when I think the podcast itself, it precipitated its biggest change.
So one of the things I'm appreciative of with the podcast, it was more than just hopping on a mic and recording. It was the positionality of what we were doing. So we had, even though it was still sort of an ensemble of RAAN, you had Black Christian voices speaking to major events of the day and actually helping shape the thinking of our listeners. So that, back in this time, 2014, there was a handful of Black Christians in these predominantly white reform circles that you always heard from. RAAN's podcast, which eventually became Pass the Mic, came along. You got a younger generation, new voices. And one of the things we said around the title of it, Pass the Mic, was that we're not the voice, we're the microphone.
Yes.
Okay.
That's a lot of the origin.
St. Louis,
Yes.
Yeah.
canon event.
So explain
Yes,
canon
just-
events, because I
yes.
think people need to hear what and know what canon events are. I don't assume everybody watches comics.
Okay, all right. Well, so
Also Bible,
yeah, well,
canonical.
they might take it a couple different ways for sure.
Sure, exactly.
No, okay. Across the Spider-Verse, the recent sequel to Into the Spider-Verse, they introduced this concept of a canon event that's like this is part of like the fabric of what makes up the history of a universe. Like this is a moment that if you can't even go back in time and change it because it's so quintessential to kind of the origins or the history of Spider-Man and makes Spider-Man who Spider-Man is, right? And so like, we've been kind of, as we were planning and prepping for this episode, thinking of what are the canon events of Pass the Mic from that standpoint.
Yeah.
So here's the thing. After Mike Brown protests Rise Up St. Louis, Mike Higgins gets arrested. You remember this?
Yep.
Yes.
So Mike Higgins gets arrested.
Pastor in St. Louis.
Pastor in St. Louis, father of Michelle Higgins. They both get arrested. And I remember there was kind of this very like interesting, like, how's the PCA going to deal with the fact that a PCA minister is getting arrested?
Presbyterian Church in America.
Yeah. And we were like, no, we have got to jump on this right now. I was like, we've got to get him on a mic immediately so that there is clear solidarity between RAAN and the Higgins.
That's good.
We had him on, we had Michelle on, and
I was on that episode too.
Were you on that episode as well?
Yeah, I was on the episode with Jemar, Michelle. I think I wasn't on the Mike Higgins episode.
And today we are discussing the ongoing situation in Ferguson, Missouri. We have two guests today. One is Tyler Burns. He's been on the show before. We've also got Michelle Higgins. She's a first-time guest to the show, but we're excited to have Michelle because she has been in Ferguson, Missouri. She's based in St. Louis.
So generally, we've all heard the stories of calm in the daytime from the hours of 5 to 6 in the morning till about 8 to 9 o'clock at night. And then tensions rising and mounting into basically standoffs. Yesterday was probably one of the more tense of the past few days. And certainly.
Then, so we had her back on after another protest because her voice was shot because she had literally lost her voice.
But it really only took one or two people, and I saw the young folks and others who did it. It just took a small number of people to really mess it up. I want to be very clear that we did shut down Highway 44, and it was beautifully choreographed for the sake of disruption, as symbolic to the disruption that injustice represents. But it went down really fast. I was texting with you, Jemar, and it changed within seconds.
And we had this kind of intentionality of making sure that we were showing solidarity.
I think it's also important to say, like, right around that time, you're starting to see a change of the guard in who has the attention of the people. And I think this is important to point out because it ties into the history and the story of Pass the Mic, because we were not tenured in terms of having big platforms, books. We weren't denominational leaders.
We were just these upstarts.
We were just these, young dudes who and ladies who felt like, oh, we have something to say. And we were representing what people were afraid to say or what people disagreed with and what they kind of shunned us for saying. And that's important to acknowledge, because this rise and how quickly it turns and changes won't make sense if you don't understand that there was a vying and a wrestling for the attention and the ears and the credibility of people
and something,
the audience that's listening.
Something is happening on the national scene that hadn't happened in our lifetimes, which was really a next wave of the civil rights movement, where when Pastor Higgins and Michelle got arrested, I mean, that had very clear reminiscences of the civil rights movement from the 50s and 60s. And then you see these marches and you hear this chant of Black Lives Matter. So it's actually very new. And we were there as a Black Christian voice to help process and interpret things. And that was one of the big reasons why a lot of people started to tune into us.
So right around this time, you have an interesting dynamic because the team is not just all in agreement on everything that's happening.
So that gets into the processing, right? Because we're processing in real time, all of us, with various different perspectives on what's going on, different thoughts about how we approach this. And so we're modeling this for people, which also gives them like an exercise of doing it themselves, but with the reality. Now I say we, obviously I'm behind the scenes, but like
very much in the conversation.
No, but like this is all part of like the zeitgeist that we're like, that is generating like, okay, what is Pass the Mic? What is RAAN?
That gets into why one of the biggest changes in the organization's history ended up happening. So obviously everyone is talking about Mike Brown. We have this Black Lives Matter chant coalescing. We have nightly protests. We have riots. We have statements. I was a youth pastor at the time, and I was scheduled to preach the end of August or a couple of weeks after Mike Brown. So I ended up preaching on, some of this in my church, which was really dangerous, because people are like, you don't talk about that here, that type of stuff. That we're all figuring this thing out in our local and national context. And I'm thinking about it, at that time I was still kind of side writing for Rapzilla, and I'm doing all this stuff and I'm trying to figure it out. And Thanksgiving, you have Thanksgiving come, and I woke up the next day, Black Friday, to a call from Jemar Tisby. And it was weird because I was like, man, I literally said out loud, like, why is Jemar calling me? So I was like, hey bro, what's going on? At that time, I wasn't in the day-to-day of RAAN. I wasn't in the day-to-day of RAAN. I was kind of in and out, and I would come in and help, but I was tuned into everything that was going on, listening to the episodes. But I'll say this, the reform stuff, specifically the reform denominational stuff, so the PCA stuff did not captivate me at all. And I think it was because I was not familiar with it, right? So I didn't come up in that. So I was the Southern Black Pentecostal, like a second generation Black Pentecostal preacher. Like it didn't resonate with me. But the current event stuff, I was always like, yes, like let's talk about this. And so Jemar said, hey, happy Thanksgiving. I'm sorry I'm calling you on the holiday, but do you have a moment to talk? I said, yeah. He said, can I send you an article? And I said, yeah, sure. Like, fine. Like, so he sends me an article. He says, I want to get your thoughts. So he hangs up and I read the article from Voddie Baucham. And I read the article about Mike Brown. And I called him back. I said, hey, I read the article. Think that's a good look. And I told him, I was like, dog, we can't run that article. Because it was so, I remember I asked, can we edit the article? I mean, we're talking about familial connections on the team. It's just a very fraught reality. And I'm saying familial connections on the team, not because I don't want to be honest, but the people involved aren't here to, give their side of the story. So
right.
I'm just
we want to be respectful.
So I'm being straight up respectful. Like they're not here to give their side of the story. I'm just talking brass tacks on the article. I was like, can this be edited? And you were like, no, he's not trying to edit any of this thing. And I was like, bro, if this is straight up, no, there's no way you can.
So, I mean, I said before, y'all have good memories, way better than I do, but I remember this distinctly. We were upstairs getting lunch or dinner at the Whole Foods in Jackson. And I was with my wife and son. And we got this article. And I'm thinking as an editor, because we want to publish this on the RAAN website and have something written to respond to the moment. And so I'm like, we got to figure this out immediately. And so I send it to y'all, try to get some input. And then I let my wife read it, who's very discerning and sharp. And she's like, oh, heck no. That was all I needed at the end of the day. But it was such a canon moment. It was a pivotal moment because can you imagine? And we were this close to publishing that.
We know. I see. I know that sounds very dramatic, but this is something I think that is kind of interesting to pull back the curtains and share with folks, like especially over the history of RAAN, Pass the Mic, because I mean, like they're intertwined. For sure.
By the way, real quick, the article was saying that
Mike Brown
live by the sword, die by the sword. Mike Brown deserved what he got,
right?
And it was such an inflammatory article. People, either loved it or hated it, and people read it who hated it, and people read it who loved it, and it actually crashed the Gospel Coalition's website. That was the article.
And there are people who literally said as a result, because the Gospel Coalition published that article, Black people, I will never read from the Gospel Coalition ever
Never
again.
submit an article, all that.
No, I remember because I was in the kitchen when I got the call from you, and I remember I didn't even read the article. You just told me the title of it, and that I'll be honest, and that it was from Voddie, and I said no, absolutely not, no, don't do it. But this is what I wanted to pull the curtain back on, because I think this is interesting, it's important, especially in those early days. It began a process, and I think that's the first time it was really like put into practice, and it's something that you replicated. Is that as kind of our leader, you were very much pulling in all of us, getting kind of some different perspectives, wrestling through those, so that any kind of, especially even like big moves, they were done with a lot of intentionality and a lot of like discussion behind the scenes. And like nothing was ever done like brazenly or like, without any, like without, that kind of group coming together. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. That's helpful.
We're passing the mic.
There's just no way that would have ever touched the website.
Pivotal moment.
Yeah.
Such a pivotal moment.
And if we had published that article, we would not be here today.
No, absolutely not.
We would have lost all credibility without probably because we're so new. Yeah. We'd only had the website for a year. And because we were so new, we couldn't have made a mistake like that.
Yeah.
We didn't have enough in the trust bank account.
Yeah.
To make that big of a withdrawal, it would have bankrupted us.
And it would have been completely contradictory to what we had been doing, which, as you said, was standing with the activists and standing with those who were standing on behalf of justice. Now, Jemar's thought process, the only thing he did say is, I don't think I should run it, he said, but there's an idea of the debate existing on a Black site versus the debate existing somewhere else.
One of those in particular was from Pastor Voddie Baucham of Grace Family Bible Church in Texas. And he wrote an article on the Gospel Coalition called Thoughts on Ferguson that sparked a whole lot of debate. I heard it actually crashed their website from the amount of traffic, the volume there. But we wanted to do a follow-up to that decision, but it's been a week and there has been a firestorm online on the blogosphere and social media about different responses. What we wanted to highlight this episode was the diversity of perspectives, even within the Reformed African American community, on the issues in Ferguson and ongoing racial tensions in our country. Because I think what it revealed was there are different ways.
But there
to
wasn't
respond,
anything to debate.
Yeah, there was no
there was like,
counterpoint.
and I've mentioned this in a previous episode, like, oh, sometimes underneath the surface you shouldn't dismiss this. No, the way this was written lacked compassion. It was written dismissively.
Yeah.
So I said, no. Like this is different. Like you're not coming at a dead body and a dead young man with compassion. Like you're just calling him a thug and labeling him by every stereotype that we're trying to avoid. So there wasn't really anything to debate. So let's take a time out. After that, we probably should. And we'll be back on Pass the Mic for the 10-year retrospective of PTM.
Coming up on part 2 of Not the Voice, the Microphone, the Pass the Mic story.
What Phil did in the beginning, the way he was able to network, make phone calls, connect with people, he just moved fast.
Yeah. Just brilliant.
He recruited people into a mission and a vision in a way that I never could, and there really wouldn't be any of this had he not been there in those beginning
Love
phases.
Phil.
Just the way he did it was so smooth.
Smooth with it. He still got it.
The groundwork was laid in this very specific canon event, people reaching out in regards to a Facebook post that was made by some apologetics dude named James White that we at best barely even knew.
Yeah, so actually what happened was...
I should say. Yeah.
So it was late at night. My wife had already gone to bed. Results are rolling in, and they finally call it for Trump. And I'm just devastated, right? And I'm thinking, one of the things I think of many thoughts is about going to church that Sunday, knowing full well that there were some people in my congregation who, just as I was lamenting and worried about what was coming next, they were celebrating.